I'm 34 years old, and I grew up in a house where widowhood was inheritance. 3 generations of women, 3 dead husbands, all drowned before turning 45. All experienced watermen who knew the tides and currents like their own pulse. All lost without witnesses, without storms, without any reason the Coast Guard could name in their reports. My grandmother was widowed at 38, my mother at 41, my aunt at 37. We called it bad luck. We called it occupational hazard. We called it anything except what it was. I met Thomas 6 months after my 33rd birthday. He was a deep-sea fisherman with 15 years on the water and no fear of family history. We married in April. By June, he was sleepwalking to the shoreline at 3 in the morning, standing waist-deep in freezing water with his mouth moving in words I couldn't hear. I found my grandmother's journal in July, hidden behind a false wall she'd built herself. 23 pages in her handwriting, dated 2 months before her husband drowned. The first line read, "We are not cursed, we are the curse." By the time I finished reading, Thomas had been missing for 11 hours. The Coast Guard found his boots at the water's edge just after dawn. This is what I should have known. This is what the women in my family spent generations hiding. This is the truth about what runs in our blood and what the ocean has always recognized in us. This is why the men who love us eventually hear a call they can't refuse. My earliest memory is my grandmother standing at the kitchen window, staring at the ocean, not crying, just standing. She did this every morning for an hour before anyone else woke up. My mother did the same thing after my father died. Same window, same hour, same blank expression. I was 7 when I realized every woman in my family over 30 wore black more often than not. The drownings followed a pattern so consistent it should have been impossible to ignore. My great-grandfather drowned at 42 while checking crab pots in 3 feet of water. Calm day, no witnesses. My grandfather drowned at 39 swimming to shore after his boat's engine died, found floating 20 yards from the beach with no water in his lungs. My father drowned at 43 while fishing from the pier on a clear afternoon. His body recovered the next morning with his tackle box still sitting on the dock, undisturbed. The Coast Guard reports were nearly identical. Experienced watermen, no apparent distress beforehand, no signs of struggle, no logical explanation for how men who'd spent their lives on and in the water could simply drown in conditions that shouldn't have challenged a child. The town noticed. Of course they noticed. 3 generations of widows from the same family, all losing their husbands the same way, created talk. But coastal communities understand that the ocean takes men. It's the price of living where we do. The question stopped being asked after the funerals. My family never questioned it at all. I remember my mother explaining my father's death to me the day after they found him. "The sea is dangerous, sweetheart, even for people who know it well. Your father was unlucky. Sometimes that's all there is." Unlucky? That was the word we used. My grandmother was unlucky. My mother was unlucky. My aunt, who lost her husband when I was 12, he drowned while teaching tourists to kayak in the bay on a windless morning. She was unlucky too. Statistical impossibility became family legacy, and we absorbed it like salt air. There were details I learned only later, small consistencies that no one had bothered to connect. All 3 men had been found within a quarter-mile of our family's house. All 3 had drowned between midnight and dawn. All 3 had been married to my family's women for at least 8 years before they died. The medical examiners noted peculiarities in their reports but didn't pursue them. My grandfather had been found with sand in his mouth but none in his lungs, as if he'd been lying on the ocean floor, breathing water like air. My father's body showed no signs of panic, no bruising, no defensive wounds, no indication he'd fought to surface. The word peaceful appeared in 2 of the 3 autopsy reports. When I was 16, I asked my grandmother directly why all the men in our family drowned. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, because we live by the core ocean, and the ocean takes what it wants. That's all there is to it. She died 2 years later, natural causes, in her sleep. She was 71. After the funeral, my mother inherited the house. She moved into my grandmother's bedroom without changing anything. The furniture stayed where it was. The curtains remained drawn. She even kept my grandmother's habit of standing at the window every morning, staring at the water. I left for college at 18 and stayed away for 10 years. I told myself it was for work, for independence, for the normal reason young people leave their hometowns. The truth was, I didn't want to become another widow standing at a window. But I came back. I always knew I would. The house pulled at me the same way the ocean pulled at the men who married into our family. By the time I was 30, I'd given up pretending I could build a life anywhere else. My mother had been dead for 3 years by then. Heart attack at 56. She'd never remarried after my father drowned. Neither had my grandmother, neither had my aunt. 3 widows who spent decades alone, staring at the water that had taken their husbands, never asking why, never digging deeper, never acknowledging that 3 generations of identical drownings meant something more than bad luck. I moved back into the family house and told myself I'd be different. I told myself I'd be careful. I told myself that awareness was protection, that knowing the pattern meant I could avoid it. Then I met Thomas. Thomas was 36 when we met, with the kind of weathered face that comes from 15 years working deep-sea fishing vessels. He'd grown up 2 towns north and had been captaining his own boat for 6 years. He knew the ocean the way most people know their own neighborhoods. He understood tides, could read weather in the color of the water, could navigate by stars when GPS failed. He'd survived 2 hurricanes at sea and a rigging accident that should have killed him. He was careful, competent, rational. I met him at a marine supply shop in October. I was buying flares for the emergency kit I kept in the house, habit from growing up coastal. He was behind me in line and mentioned he was getting the same brand. We started talking about boat safety, then about the water in general, then about nothing in particular while standing in the parking lot for 40 minutes. He asked for my number. I gave it to him. I told him about my family on our 3rd date. Not the truth. I didn't know the truth yet, but the facts as I understood them. 3 generations of widows, 3 drowned husbands, all experienced watermen, all lost to the ocean. Thomas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "That's terrible. I'm sorry." Then he said, "But I'm still here." It wasn't dismissive. It was just factual. He was alive. He was sitting across from me. The past wasn't the present. I wanted desperately to believe that. We spent the winter together. Thomas worked 4 days a week on his boat, commercial fishing for cod and haddock. When he was on shore, we were inseparable. He taught me to read nautical charts. I taught him to make my grandmother's fish stew. We took long walks on the beach in freezing wind and didn't care. He proposed in March, on the dock behind the family house. No grand gesture. He just asked if I'd marry him. I said yes before I'd finished hearing the question. We got married in April. Small ceremony. Courthouse downtown. 2 witnesses we pulled from the clerk's office. Afterward, we went to dinner at the same restaurant where we'd had our first real date. Thomas moved into the family house the next day. He said it made sense. It was bigger than his apartment, already paid off, right on the water. I agreed. I didn't tell him I felt safer having him there, like his presence could interrupt whatever pattern haunted the walls. The first 6 weeks were ordinary, better than ordinary. Thomas kept his boat moored at the dock out back. I kept working remotely for the environmental nonprofit I'd joined 2 years earlier. We fell into an easy rhythm of domesticity that felt earned and real. He'd wake up before dawn to check the boat or prep for fishing trips. I'd wake up an hour later and make coffee. We'd have breakfast together when his schedule allowed. On his days off, we'd drive up the coast or stay in bed until noon. There was no sleepwalking, no strange behavior, no indication that anything Was wrong. I let myself believe I'd broken the pattern, that my awareness had been enough, that marrying a man who knew the ocean meant he couldn't be taken by it. I let myself believe love could outsmart fate. The first time I woke up and Thomas wasn't in bed, I assumed he'd gone down to the boat early. It was late May, fishing season. He'd mentioned wanting to repair some netting before his next trip. I checked my phone. 3:17 in the morning. I got up and looked out the window. The boat was dark. The dock was empty. I found him at the shore. He was standing waist-deep in the water, still wearing the t-shirt and shorts he'd gone to bed in. The tide was coming in. Small waves broke against his chest. He didn't react, didn't move, just stood there, facing out toward the open ocean. His eyes were open. I called his name from the beach. He didn't turn. I called again, louder. Nothing. I waded in after him. The water was shockingly cold, 55 degrees, maybe less. My teeth started chattering before I reached him. I grabbed his arm. Thomas. He didn't look at me. His lips were moving, forming words I couldn't hear over the sound of the waves. His expression was blank, but not empty. He looked like someone listening intently to a conversation I couldn't perceive. I pulled harder. Thomas, wake up. He blinked, turned his head slowly, like he was moving through something thicker than water. Looked at me with no recognition. Then his eyes focused. He gasped, sucking in air like he'd been holding his breath. His whole body started shaking. What? He looked around at the ocean, at me, at his soaked clothes. What happened? I pulled him back to shore. He stumbled twice, disoriented, his legs unsteady under him. By the time we reached the house, he was shivering so violently he could barely speak. I got him into dry clothes and wrapped him in blankets. He sat on the couch, staring at nothing. I don't remember leaving the bed, he said finally. I don't remember walking down here. You were sleepwalking, I said. He shook his head. I've never sleepwalked in my life. He hadn't. He'd told me that weeks earlier when we'd been talking about childhood oddities. He slept like the dead, he'd said. Never moved, never dreamed much. Maybe it's stress, I offered, not believing it. Maybe. He went back to bed an hour later. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting at the kitchen window, staring at the ocean. She woke at 3 a.m. to cold sheets. Thomas's side of the bed was empty, not rumpled like he'd gotten up for water or the bathroom, flat and cooling like he'd been gone long enough for his body heat to fade completely. She found him at the shoreline, waist deep in the ocean, standing perfectly still in the surf, water dark around him, the kind of February cold that stops your breath the moment it touches skin. He wore only boxer shorts. His arms hung at his sides. His eyes were open. She called his name from the beach. He didn't turn, didn't react, just stood there as waves rolled past him, foam breaking against his ribs, and his mouth moved. Not randomly, not shivering. Forming shapes, words maybe, or something close to language. Silent conversation with something she couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't perceive except through the precise movement of his lips and the terrible absence of recognition when she finally waded in and grabbed his arm. His skin was ice. Not cold, ice. The kind of temperature that should have sent him stumbling back to shore 10 minutes ago, gasping and shaking, survival instinct overriding everything else. He didn't shiver, didn't gasp, didn't acknowledge her hand on his wrist even when she yanked hard enough to hurt. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon line where ocean met sky, tracking something out there in the dark, and his mouth kept forming those shapes. She dragged him backward through the shallows. He came without resistance, but also without awareness, body moving where she pulled it, but consciousness somewhere else entirely. And when they reached dry sand, he stopped again, turned back toward the water like a compass finding north. "Thomas!" She stepped in front of him, put both hands on his face. His eyes were open, but not seeing, looking through her at the waves beyond. "Thomas, wake up." Nothing. She slapped him, hard enough that her palm stung, that his head snapped to the side. He blinked, focused on her face. Confusion, replacing that awful blank stare, and then immediate shivering, violent whole-body tremors, as if his nervous system had just remembered it was supposed to register cold. "What?" his teeth chattered. "What happened?" "You were in the water. I was—" He looked down at himself. Soaked boxer shorts, bare feet covered in sand, his skin already reddening from cold exposure. "I was asleep. You were standing in the ocean. I don't remember." He wrapped his arms around himself, shaking so hard he could barely stand. "I don't remember getting up. I don't remember walking here. I was dreaming about—" He stopped. "About what?" "Singing." He stared back at the waterline. Someone was singing. Under the waves. I could almost understand the words. She got him inside. Hot shower until his core temperature came back. Blankets. Tea he didn't drink because his hands shook too much to hold the cup steady. He fell asleep on the couch at 4:30 a.m., wrapped in every blanket they owned, and slept so deeply she checked his breathing twice to make sure he was still alive. When he woke at noon, he didn't remember the singing, said he didn't remember dreaming at all. She wanted to believe it was sleepwalking, stress from the new marriage maybe, or delayed processing of his father's death 6 months before the wedding. She'd read about sleep disorders triggered by life changes, but Thomas had never sleepwalked before, and sleepwalkers didn't usually wade into February ocean and stand there like they were waiting for something. She called his doctor that afternoon, got an appointment for Thursday, described the incident as unusual nighttime behavior, and received reassurance that stress-induced somnambulism was manageable with proper sleep hygiene and possibly medication. The doctor asked if Thomas had seemed confused or disoriented. She said yes. Didn't mention the way his mouth had moved in silent conversation, or how his eyes had tracked something she couldn't see, or the fact that he'd stood in water cold enough to trigger hypothermia without his body registering distress. Those details felt too close to something she couldn't name, something that would sound like paranoia or superstition if she spoke it aloud. So she kept them to herself, told herself it was a one-time incident, an anomaly. The kind of strange story they'd laugh about in 10 years. Remember that time you almost drowned yourself sleepwalking? Can you believe that? Except part of her, the part that had grown up in a house full of widows, that had heard whispered conversations stop when she entered rooms, that had learned not to ask too many questions about how the men in her family died. That part knew better. That part recognized the pattern beginning. Thomas seemed fine for the rest of Thursday, embarrassed about the incident but otherwise normal. He went to work Friday morning. He was crew chief on a commercial fishing boat, worked 4-day trips out of the harbor, and kissed her goodbye at 5 a.m., like always. She watched his truck disappear down the coast road and told herself everything was fine. The doctor's appointment was in 6 days. They'd figure out what caused the sleepwalking. They'd fix it. Nothing was wrong. But she locked the bedroom door that night anyway, and the night after that. And when Thomas came home Monday evening after 4 days at sea, she hugged him too tight and didn't let go for a long time. He smelled like salt water and fish and diesel fuel. Normal, exactly like he always smelled after a trip. "You okay?" he asked into her hair. She nodded against his chest, didn't trust her voice. "I'm okay," he said, misunderstanding. "We hit our quota early. Seas were calm. Good trip." She believed him, wanted to believe the sleepwalking had been anomaly, exhaustion, stress. That coming home safe from 4 days of deep-sea work meant the danger had passed. But that night, Tuesday, 2:47 a.m. according to the clock, she woke to find the bedroom door open and Thomas gone. She found him faster the second time, already knew where to look. Same spot on the beach, same waist-deep placement in the surf, same open eyes tracking something invisible in the dark water, same mouth-forming silent words, same absence of cold response despite water temperature that couldn't be above 40 degrees. This time she didn't try talking to him first. She grabbed his arm and pulled. Got him moving toward shore before he had time to resist, and when they reached dry sand, she positioned herself between him and the ocean, blocked his sightline to the waves. That helped. Whatever he'd been fixed on, breaking line of sight seemed to weaken the hold. He blinked, focused on her, started shivering. Again? His voice cracked. It happened again? She nodded. I heard it again. He looked past her toward the water, and she saw his expression shift, confusion giving way to something that looked almost like longing. The singing. It was so clear this time, almost like words, almost like, "Stop." She gripped his shoulders. Don't listen to it. Listen to what? But his eyes stayed on the waves. There's nothing there. She got him inside. Same routine, shower, blankets, tea. This time, he held the cup steady enough to drink, hands only shaking a little, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet. Something's wrong with me. We'll figure it out. The doctor's going to say it's stress. He set the cup down. Or a sleep disorder, and maybe it is, but it doesn't feel like sleepwalking. It feels like... He trailed off. Like what? Like something's calling me. He looked at his hands. Like there's a voice under the water, and it knows my name, and if I could just get close enough to hear what it's saying, I'd understand something important, something I'm supposed to know. The way he said it, not frightened, not confused, but almost reverent, made her stomach drop. There's nothing there, she said. Nothing's calling you. I know that. He rubbed his face. Logically, I know that. But when I'm out there, when I'm in the water, it feels real. It feels like the only real thing in the world. She made him promise to see the doctor in the morning instead of waiting until Thursday. He promised. She stayed awake the rest of the night, watching him sleep, listening for any sign that he might be waking, might be getting up, might be heading for the door. He slept through until 7 a.m., woke groggy but present, remembered their conversation, kept his promise about the doctor. The appointment yielded nothing useful. No signs of seizure activity, no indication of sleep disorder beyond the somnambulism itself. Blood work came back normal. The doctor prescribed low-dose medication to discourage sleepwalking and recommended a sleep study if the behavior continued. It continued. Thursday night, Saturday night, Monday night, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always the same location on the beach, always standing in the surf with his mouth moving and his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. By the fourth incident, she'd started sleeping in fits, 20-minute increments, alarms set every half hour so she could check that Thomas was still in bed. She looked like hell, felt worse. But at least she was catching him faster now, pulling him from the water before he'd been standing there long enough to develop hypothermia. He started changing in other ways, too. Small things at first. He'd always loved the ocean, grew up on boats, couldn't imagine working anywhere but the water. But now his attachment looked different, obsessive. He'd stand at the living room window for an hour at a time, just watching the waves. Stop mid-conversation to listen when the tide came in. Talk about the sound of surf like other people talked about music, like it meant something beyond noise and rhythm. It's different now, he told her one afternoon, 2 weeks after the sleepwalking started. I never noticed before how much variation there is. The waves aren't random. There's a pattern, almost like language if you listen long enough. It's water hitting rocks, she said. There's no pattern. Maybe. But he kept listening anyway. He started turning down extra fishing trips. Thomas, who'd never met overtime he didn't want, who loved being on the water more than anywhere else, suddenly making excuses about needing rest, needing time at home. Except he didn't rest at home. He walked the beach, sat on the rocks at the breakwater, stood at the tide line, and watched the surf with an expression she couldn't read, somewhere between meditation and hunger. His crew chief asked if everything was okay. Thomas said yes, said he was tired, that's all, needed a few weeks of lighter schedule. The crew chief called her afterward, asked if Thomas was sick, said he'd never seen anyone change this fast, like the oceans got into him somehow, like he can't think about anything else. She didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to explain that. Yes, exactly, like the oceans got into him, like something in the water had noticed her husband and decided to keep him. The sleep study appointment was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Too long. She could see Thomas deteriorating day by day, losing weight because he forgot to eat, losing focus because even when he was awake, his attention was always half turned toward the sound of waves. And the worst part, the thing that terrified her more than the sleepwalking or the obsession, he was starting to go willingly. The last 2 times she'd found him in the water, he'd resisted when she tried to pull him back. Not violently, not even consciously. But his body had tensed, had tried to stay in the surf, and when she'd finally gotten him to shore, he'd looked at her with something close to resentment. "Why did you stop me?" he'd asked, after the most recent incident. 4 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was so close to hearing it clearly. Whatever's singing down there, I almost understood it this time. There's nothing singing. You keep saying that. His voice was flat. But you can't hear it? Maybe it's not for you. Maybe it's only for me. She'd made him sleep with his ankles zip-tied to the bed frame that night. Hated herself for it. Hated the necessity even more. He hadn't fought the restraint, hadn't protested, just lay down and closed his eyes and slept deeply for the first time in weeks, and she sat awake in the chair by the window and knew with absolute certainty that restraints weren't going to be enough. That whatever had its hooks in Thomas was reeling him in slowly, patiently, and sooner or later he was going to slip past whatever precautions she put in place. 3 generations of widows, 3 generations of drownings. She'd thought she was different, thought Thomas was different, thought awareness and precaution could break whatever pattern had claimed the other women in her family. But sitting in that chair, watching her husband sleep with his ankle tethered like an animal, listening to the tide come in outside, she understood for the first time that maybe the pattern wasn't about carelessness or bad luck. Maybe it was about inevitability. The ocean had noticed Thomas the moment he'd bound himself to her, and the ocean always took what it wanted eventually. She just hadn't known yet that the ocean was taking what it was owed, what her blood had promised generations before she was born. That understanding came 4 days later when she finally opened the false wall in her grandmother's bedroom and read the truth written in handwriting she recognized from birthday cards and recipe notes. We are not cursed. We are the curse. I was 31 years old when I stopped being fully human. That's not accurate. I was 31 when I learned I had never been fully human at all. Thomas had been pulling toward the water for 6 weeks. The sleepwalking episodes were happening every 3 nights now, sometimes twice in one night. I'd taken to sleeping in 10-minute intervals, waking to check that he was still beside me, his chest rising and falling in the darkness, his body still mine and not the ocean's. On the morning I found the journal, he'd been in the water again. 4 a.m. I'd dragged him out by his shoulders, his skin so cold it didn't feel like flesh anymore, and he'd looked at me with eyes that took a full minute to remember my face. I was talking to someone, he'd said. She was explaining something important. Who was she? I don't remember. But I understood while she was speaking. He went back to bed. I went to my grandmother's house. She'd been dead 11 years. The house had stayed in the family, passed to my mother, then to me when she drowned. I'd been meaning to sell it. Instead, I'd left it empty, visiting once a month to check for leaks and confirm the loneliness hadn't somehow become solid enough to see. I'd never questioned why grandmother lived alone for 43 years after grandfather's drowning. Never asked why she'd warned my mother against marrying a fisherman, then gone silent when she did it anyway. Never wondered why she'd looked at me with something like grief the day I introduced her to Thomas. She knew. She'd known exactly what would happen. The journal wouldn't be in an obvious place. If it had been, my mother would have found it, would have understood before her own husband walked into the water when I was 7 years old. Grandmother had hidden it for a reason. I started in her bedroom. The furniture was still there, untouched beneath dust sheets. Her bed faced the window that looked toward the ocean. Every woman in my family slept facing the water. I pulled the sheets away, checked drawers that held only ancient sachets and yellowed photographs, knocked on walls the way people do in movies, listening for hollowness, feeling ridiculous until the section beside her wardrobe sounded different, not hollow, muffled. The panel looked identical to the others, same paint, same trim. But when I pressed the lower corner, something clicked. The panel swung inward on hinges I hadn't seen, revealing a space barely large enough for what it held. One journal, leather-bound, salt-stained at the edges, and beneath it, 3 photographs of women I didn't recognize, all standing at the shoreline with expressions I understood immediately. The handwriting inside was grandmother's. The date on the first entry was 2 weeks after her wedding. Robert asked me this morning why I cried when he said he loved me. I told him they were happy tears. That was the first time I lied to my husband. It will not be the last. How do I tell him that every declaration of love is another link in the chain that will pull him under? How do I explain that the ocean has been listening to us since our wedding night, learning the shape of his devotion, and when it knows him fully, it will call him by name? I rid standing up, couldn't make myself sit down, couldn't make myself stop. Mother told me the truth 3 days before the wedding. I screamed at her, called her a liar, said I would be different, that Robert was too strong a swimmer, too careful, too alive to drown like the others. She held my face and said, "You are not cursed. We are the curse. The ocean knows its own blood and will always come to collect what we owe for the song in our veins." She explained it the way her mother explained it to her. We descend from women who were not entirely women. Generations ago, something else moved in our bloodline, not Siren. We don't have the song, don't have the tale, don't have the deliberate hunger. But we carry the residue, the echo, enough that the ocean recognizes us as kin, enough that when we bond with a man, when we let him love us fully, the water takes notice. "It's a claiming," she said. "The men become marked. Their devotion to us creates a frequency the ocean can hear. And because we carry sea blood, however diluted, the water believes it has rights to anything we've touched that intimately. Marriage is the trigger, the vow, the binding. Before that, we're safe to love. After, we're bait tied to a dock, and the men we've married are what gets pulled under." I turned pages with shaking hands. Grandmother's handwriting stayed steady for years, then started breaking apart. Robert is hearing it now. He doesn't say so, but I see him pause mid-conversation, head tilted like he's trying to identify a distant sound. Last night he asked if I heard singing. I said no. Another lie. I hear nothing. The call isn't for me, it's for him, because he's mine, because he swore before witnesses that he would belong to me until death, and the ocean holds us to our contracts. I researched every myth I could find. The pattern is consistent across centuries, across coastlines. Part-blood siren women, we're not in control. We don't choose this. Our presence does the choosing. The ocean wants back what it believes we stole from it when we came ashore generations ago. It can't have us, so it takes what we love. Payment, balance, ancient law we can't break because we don't know the language it's written in. Robert drowned this morning. They'll call it an accident. They'll say the current was unusually strong, that even experienced swimmers can be caught off guard. They're wrong. The water was calm. I watched from the window. He walked in deliberately, waded out until he was chest deep, then went under like something pulled him by the ankles. He didn't fight. That's what the autopsy won't explain. There was no struggle because he didn't want to struggle. By the end, they never do. The call becomes too beautiful. They choose the water over us. The entries stopped for a decade. When they resumed, the handwriting was different. Older. "My daughter is engaged," I told her. The truth last night. She responded exactly as I did. Denial, fury, accusations of insanity. She'll marry him anyway. She'll believe love is stronger than blood, and in 2 years, maybe 3, she'll watch him walk into the ocean. Then she'll come back to this house, search until she finds this journal, and understand too late that I wasn't trying to ruin her happiness. I was trying to save his life. I'm hiding this now. If she reads it before the pattern manifests, she'll think I'm mad. If she reads it after, the knowledge will only sharpen her grief. Better for my granddaughter to find it, if the bloodline continues. Better to give her the truth before she falls in love, before she condemns another man to drowning by accepting his ring. I'm sealing this behind the wall in the room where I slept alone for 40 years. If she's desperate enough to tear the house apart looking for answers, she's ready to hear them. The final entry was dated 3 days before grandmother's death. I don't know if the blood weakens over generations or strengthens. I don't know if moving inland would help, or if the ocean's memory is longer than geography. I don't know if refusing marriage would break the pattern or simply make us a different kind of killer. I only know this: we are not monsters. We are women who carry something monstrous. We did not ask for this inheritance. But ignorance doesn't make us innocent. If my granddaughter is reading this, it means she's already lost someone. It means the ocean has claimed another man who loved the wrong woman. I'm sorry. I should have burned this house down and salted the earth. I should have ended the bloodline with my own hands. Instead, I hid the truth and hoped evolution would erase what mythology planted in our veins. I was wrong. The water remembers longer than we do. I closed the journal as the sun came up. Thomas had been missing for 11 hours. I read the journal 4 times in the chair beside grandmother's bed, read it until I could recite sections from memory, until the words stopped sounding impossible and started sounding like diagnosis. We are not sirens. That's the first thing I had to understand. The mythology gets it wrong, or simplified, or maybe the full truth was never meant to be written down. Sirens in the old stories are deliberate. They sing, they choose, they perch on rocks and lure ships to destruction with intention and hunger. We don't do any of that. We're what happens when that bloodline dilutes over generations. Siren ancestry stretched so thin it doesn't give us the song or the scales or the immortality. We're not creatures. We're women who carry genetic memory of something that used to be more than human. Enough to mark us, not enough to give us control. Grandmother's journal referenced older texts, fragments she'd tracked down in maritime libraries and occult archives. The pattern appeared across cultures with different names but identical mechanics. Mediterranean families with daughter lines that drowned husbands. Celtic widows whose men walked into locks after marriage. Nordic women whose binding ceremonies ended in seafaring husbands lost to calm waters within years. The academic term, when these things were still documented, was thalassic susceptibility inheritance. The practical term was siren blood. It passes through the female line, matrilineal, mothers to daughters, though not every daughter inherits equally. Some carry it dormant. Some marry inland men who never hear the call because they lack the spiritual proximity to water. Some get lucky with husbands who die of other causes before the ocean can claim them. But for women like grandmother, like my mother, like me, women who stayed coastal, who married men who worked the water, who let themselves fall in love without running, the pattern was consistent. The drownings only happened after marriage. That's the detail that had haunted grandmother for 40 years. Thomas had been swimming these waters since childhood. He'd survived storms that killed experienced crews. He'd worked deep-sea fishing for a decade without incident. Then he married me. 6 weeks later, he started hearing voices beneath the waves. The journal explained it through a theory grandmother had pieced together from folklore fragments. Our blood creates a resonance, something in our genetic makeup, whether literally supernatural or so biologically unusual it mimics magic, emits a frequency the ocean recognizes. Most of the time, we're invisible to it. Background noise, The water can't distinguish us from any other coastal woman. Marriage changes that. The vow, the public binding, the witness declaration that another person now belongs to us, and we to them. That creates a new frequency, a duet instead of a solo. And the ocean, which has been listening since our bloodline first walked on land, hears that harmony and wants it. Except it can't have us. We're the ones who carry its blood. We're protected by the same ancestry that dooms the men we marry, so it takes them instead. Payment for our continued existence on land, compensation for the part of its bloodline that left the water generations ago. Ancient law enforced by something too old to negotiate with, the men become marked. Not immediately, but progressively. Their devotion to us creates psychic vulnerability. Every act of love, every moment of genuine, bonded intimacy strengthens the call they'll eventually hear. The ocean learns them, learns the shape of their attachment to us. And when it knows them fully, when their love is deep enough, complete enough, it speaks to them in voices they can't refuse. That's why they don't struggle. That's why experienced swimmers drown in shallow water. That's why the medical examiners always note the expressions of peace. By the time the men walk into the water, they want to go. The call has become more beautiful than anything on land, more beautiful than us. They're not choosing death. They're choosing what sounds like transcendence. We're the bait. They're the catch. And we don't learn the truth until after we've already lured them to the hook. Grandmother wrote about watching grandfather wade into the ocean. She'd known what was happening, but couldn't stop it. When she screamed his name, he didn't turn around. When she ran into the water after him, he moved deeper with strength she couldn't match. By the time she reached the place he'd been standing, there was nothing but disturbed sand and the sense, she wrote this explicitly, that something vast had just accepted delivery. She'd gone to the police, filed a report, attended the funeral. Let people call it a tragic accident. Never corrected them because what would she say? That her husband was claimed by the ocean as payment for her siren-blooded existence? That marriage to her had marked him for drowning the moment he said his vows? She lived alone for 4 decades afterward, refused every man who showed interest. Let people think she was devoted to grandfather's memory when the truth was simpler and worse. She couldn't risk killing anyone else. My mother hadn't understood in time, met my father, fell in love, ignored grandmother's warnings because they sounded like superstition, had 7 years of happy marriage before he started sleepwalking to the beach. Grandmother tried to explain then, but my mother wouldn't listen. Thought it was grief-induced delusion that grandmother had constructed an elaborate mythology to cope with random tragedy. Then my father drowned, and my mother spent the next 23 years refusing to read the journal grandmother kept trying to give her, refusing to acknowledge the pattern, refusing to believe she'd killed the man she loved by accepting his ring. When my mother drowned, it wasn't a man the ocean wanted. It was her, a different kind of claiming. I think she walked in deliberately. I think she finally believed the truth and couldn't live with it. The journal included a list grandmother had compiled: 7 generations, 43 marriages, 40 documented drownings of husbands, and 4 drownings of the women themselves. I added Thomas's name in the margin, number 44. The sun had been up for 3 hours when I finally stood from grandmother's chair. My legs barely held me. I walked to the window that faced the ocean, the same window grandmother had looked through when she watched her husband disappear. The water was calm, beautiful, the kind of blue that tourism boards use in advertisements. Somewhere beneath that surface, Thomas was hearing the song I would never hear, learning the language I couldn't speak, becoming something other than the man who'd promised me forever. The Coast Guard had been searching since dawn. I should have been with them, should have been coordinating, insisting, refusing to give up hope. But grandmother's journal was explicit. Once a man walks into this water willingly, once he wades in past his waist, with that expression of listening, of finally understanding, he's already gone. The ocean doesn't give them back alive. I stood at that window for 11 hours, stood there while the search continued, stood there while the sun tracked across the sky and touched the horizon, stood there while my phone rang with updates I didn't answer, stood there and felt, for the first time in my life, the thing that lived in my blood, the piece of me that wasn't entirely human, the inheritance I'd carried unknowingly since birth. I couldn't hear the song, but I could feel the ocean listening. And I understood, with the certainty grandmother must have felt, that Thomas was never coming home. I went back through the weeks with new eyes. The journal was still open on my grandmother's hidden desk when I started cataloging what I'd missed, what I'd dismissed, what I'd interpreted as love instead of summoning. Thomas had always loved the ocean. That's what I told myself. He was a fisherman. Of course he watched the water. Of course he knew the tides. Of course he spent hours at the shore between trips. That was normal. That was his profession. But it had intensified after the wedding. I could see it now in the small accumulations I'd written off as coincidence. The way he'd begun waking before dawn to watch the sunrise over the water when he'd never been an early riser before. How he'd started standing at the kitchen window during breakfast, coffee growing cold in his hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. The evening walks that stretched longer each week, first 20 minutes, then an hour, then 2, until I'd started eating dinner alone and finding him on the rocks after dark, just standing there listening. I'd thought it was peace, contentedness, the satisfaction of a man who'd found where he belonged. The dreams started 3 weeks after we married. He'd mentioned them casually, the way you share something strange but not disturbing. Voices underwater, he said, singing in languages he didn't recognize but somehow understood. He described them as beautiful, haunting. He'd wake up with melodies stuck in his head that he couldn't reproduce, couldn't hum back, but felt like he'd known his entire life. I'd asked if they frightened him. No, he'd said. They felt like coming home. I'd kissed him and rolled over and gone back to sleep. I'd thought it was poetry, the subconscious processing of a man who spent his life on the water, whose dreams would naturally be ocean-soaked. I'd found it romantic. 4 weeks in, he'd begun collecting shells. Thomas had never been a collector of anything, but suddenly there were shells appearing on the windowsill, on the bathroom counter, lined up on the kitchen table. Not tourist shells, the perfect specimens you find in gift shops. These were broken things, fragments, pieces worn smooth by years of tide. He couldn't explain why he picked them up, just said they felt important, that they meant something he couldn't articulate. I'd teased him about becoming sentimental in marriage. He'd smiled, but his eyes had stayed on the shells. The conversations with the water started at 5 weeks. I'd find him standing at the shore, lips moving. When I asked what he was doing, he'd look confused. Said he didn't realize he'd been speaking out loud, thought he was just thinking. But his mouth had been forming words I couldn't hear from 20 feet away, shaping sentences in rhythm with the waves. Once I got close enough to catch fragments. He was answering questions, responding to something I couldn't perceive, pausing as if listening, then speaking again in that subvocal murmur that I'd convinced myself was just thinking out loud, processing his day, talking through problems the way some people do. But he'd been having a conversation. The sleepwalking was just the visible culmination of what had been building since we'd bound ourselves together. Since he'd become mine and I'd unknowingly marked him as payment for whatever debt ran in my blood. I read my grandmother's journal entry from July 1962, 3 months before my grandfather drowned. He says the water is calling his name. Not metaphorically, he hears his name in the tide. I tell him it's just sound, just waves on rocks, the mind finding patterns in chaos. But he knows his own name. He knows the difference between coincidence and calling. I see him struggling against it. I watch him grip the porch railing when the pull gets strong, knuckles white, jaw clenched, fighting something I can't help him fight. He loves me enough to resist, But I know, we both know, that love won't be enough. The ocean is patient. It will wait until his strength fails, until one night the pull is stronger than his will, and I can't warn him what I am, because knowing won't save him. It will only make him afraid of me before he dies. Thomas had gripped the porch railing exactly that way 2 nights before the sleepwalking started. I'd asked if he was feeling all right. He'd said he was fine, just dizzy for a moment. But I'd seen his knuckles, bone white against weathered wood, holding on like a man in a windstorm, though the air was perfectly still. Grandmother's journal had an entry from 1957, 4 years before she lost him. Today he asked me if I've ever heard singing underwater. Not the mechanical sounds of boats or the mammal calls you can record, actual singing, human voices in harmony. I lied and said no, but I heard it too once when I was 7. I put my head under the bathwater and heard my mother's voice and my grandmother's voice and voices going back further than I could count, all singing the same song I didn't know the words to. I never did it again. He's hearing it now in the ocean. He says it only happens when he's thinking of me. The night before Thomas's first sleepwalking episode, he'd come home from a day trip on the boat and held me in the doorway for a full minute without speaking. When I asked what was wrong, he said he'd heard me singing while he was hauling nets. I told him I was at work all day. Couldn't have been me. He'd nodded slowly, said he knew that, said it didn't make sense, but he'd heard my voice coming up from the deep water, singing something wordless and old, and he'd wanted to dive in and follow it down. He'd laughed when he said it, shook his head at his own foolishness. I'd laughed too. Neither of us had understood he was describing the first stage of claiming. The boots would be at the water's edge in 6 days. I woke at dawn to an empty bed and knew immediately. No confusion, no groggy hope that he'd gone to make coffee or stepped outside for air. The sheets on his side were cold. He'd been gone for hours, and the quality of silence in the house had changed. The specific emptiness that comes when you're alone in a space that should contain 2 people. I found his boots at the shore at 6:47 a.m., placed neatly side by side at the high tide line, laces still tied, positioned as if he'd stepped out of them carefully before walking into the water in his bare feet. The sand around them was smooth. No struggle, no drag marks, just boots and then nothing. The ocean was calm, glassy, the kind of perfect conditions that make drowning impossible to explain. I called the Coast Guard at 6:51 a.m. The operator asked standard questions I answered automatically. When did I last see him? Was he depressed? Had he been drinking? Any history of mental illness? Any reason to believe this was intentional? I said no to everything except the last one. There's a reason, I said, but you won't believe it. She told me units were being dispatched, asked me to stay by the phone. Her voice had the practiced calm of someone who'd done this before, but there was something else underneath, a recognition maybe, or resignation. Later, I'd learned she'd taken the calls for 2 of the previous drownings in my family. She knew our name, knew the pattern. The Coast Guard arrived at 7:15 a.m. 3 boats deployed, helicopter dispatched. They searched in expanding grids from the point where his boots sat, accusing on the sand. I stood on the beach, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over my shoulders, and watched them work with the efficient precision of people executing a protocol they knew would fail. One of the officers came to stand beside me at 8:30 a.m. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we've documented 7 similar incidents involving your family, all experienced swimmers, all calm conditions, all walked in voluntarily and didn't come back out." I asked if they'd found any of them alive. "No, ma'am." I asked how long they'd keep searching anyway, as long as there's any chance, but his face said he already knew there wasn't. I'd finished reading grandmother's journal at 5:52 a.m., 55 minutes before I found the boots. She'd written the final entry the morning after. My grandfather disappeared. He's been gone 9 hours. They're still searching, but I know they won't find him breathing. The ocean doesn't return what it claims. Not alive, I should have told him. Should have explained what he'd married into. But I was selfish. I wanted love more than I wanted his safety. I chose my happiness over his survival, and now he's drowned because I was too much of a coward to stay alone. If there's a hell for women like us, I'll deserve it. But I think we're already there. I think this is the punishment, not being cursed but being the curse itself, killing with love, drowning the men who are foolish enough to want us. Thomas had been missing 11 hours by the time I understood what I'd done to him. 11 hours in water that ranged from 48 to 53 degrees. Survivability at that temperature, approximately 6 hours, for an excellent swimmer in perfect health. Thomas had been healthy, strong, a man who'd spent his life in the ocean and knew how to survive it. But you can't survive something you're swimming toward instead of away from. The helicopter made passes until 2 p.m. The boats continued until dusk. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no evidence of where he'd gone after walking past the point where his boots ended and the water began. One of the search team told me this was common in compulsion cases. I asked what that meant. Cases where the victim seems to have entered the water deliberately, of their own will. We find them later, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, but never far from where they went in, like they swam down instead of out. He didn't say supernatural, didn't say summoned, or claimed, or sacrifice. But he'd been working these waters for 30 years. He'd pulled bodies from my family tree before. He knew something was wrong with us, even if he didn't have language for what. At 6 p.m. they suspended active searching. They'd resume at dawn, they said. But the officer who'd spoken to me earlier pulled me aside and said what we both already knew. After 11 hours in this water, ma'am, we're looking for recovery, not rescue. I went home to the house that still smelled like Thomas's coffee and Thomas's soap and Thomas's skin. The journal was still open on grandmother's desk. I read the entry she'd written 1 week after they found my grandfather's body. They returned him to me. The ocean didn't have to, could have kept him, could have pulled him out to the deep trenches where nothing would ever surface. But it gave him back, laid him on the beach like an offering, like proof. The coroner said he looked peaceful, said there was no water in his lungs, which made no sense for a drowning, but sometimes the body does strange things in the final moments. I didn't correct him. Didn't say that men claimed by siren blood don't drown the way normal people drown. They breathe water like coming home. They die wanting it. The ocean is kind to them, at least, kinder than it is to us. We have to keep living. I sat at her desk until midnight, waiting for the call I knew would come. Not that night, but soon. The ocean would give Thomas back. It always did. It wanted us to see what our love cost. They found Thomas 3 days later. The Coast Guard called at dawn. His body had washed up on the beach a quarter-mile from our house, deposited gently on the sand above the tide line, as if something had carried him there and laid him down with care. The currents should have taken him north. The officer told me this carefully, the way you tell someone a fact that doesn't quite make sense. In 3 days, with the prevailing currents, a body enters the water. At our beach should drift 8 to 12 miles up the coast. Thomas had moved a quarter-mile in the opposite direction. I didn't ask how that was possible. I already knew. The medical examiner noted his expression. Peaceful, she said. No signs of struggle. No water in the stomach, which sometimes happens when drowning victims fight and swallow. His hands were unclenched. His face looked like he'd fallen asleep. She didn't say what she was thinking. I could see it in the way she paused, the way she glanced at the file with my family name on it before looking back at me. 7 unexplained compulsion drownings in 4 generations, all men who married into the same family, all recovered with the same peaceful expression in water that should have carried them far from home. The local officers knew. They didn't speak about it, but I saw recognition in their faces, the kind that comes from growing up hearing stories your parents never fully explained. One of the older men touched his cap when he left, a gesture that felt less like respect and more like apology. They returned Thomas to me the way the ocean had returned him, gently, with unspoken acknowledgement that this was claiming, not accident. I understood then what grandmother had meant when she wrote that the ocean always sends them back, not as bodies lost to current and chaos, but as proof. I didn't leave the coastal town. I thought about it. Spent weeks researching inland cities, places where you couldn't smell salt air or hear waves. I wondered if distance would weaken whatever my blood calls to, or if the connection reaches anywhere water touches, rivers, lakes, rain-soaked ground. Grandmother's journal didn't say. Maybe she never tried to leave. Maybe she knew that running doesn't break what you carry in your veins. I could never risk loving again. This I know. With the same certainty, I know my own name. The compulsion doesn't require my intent or awareness. It simply is. Any man who binds himself to me will eventually hear the call. The ocean is patient. It will wait years if necessary, but it always collects. The worst question is the one I can't answer. What if I have daughters? Would they inherit this? Would I pass on this bloodline of accidental destruction, this beautiful and horrible legacy that turns love into sacrifice? Some nights I think the most merciful choice is to become the generation that ends it, to choose extinction over continuation, to let the siren blood dilute into nothing rather than curse more women with this inheritance. Other nights I think that's exactly what the silence and shame want. That maybe if daughters knew from the beginning what they carried, if they grew up understanding instead of discovering through tragedy, the pattern could change. I don't have the answer. I only have grandmother's journal and my own testimony written in pages I've added to hers. If there are granddaughters, great-granddaughters, women of my blood who come after, this is for them. Not a warning to fear what they are, but the truth given freely that we were denied. The ocean knows its own. I understand that now. What I don't yet understand is whether we're prisoners of that knowledge or whether, finally spoken aloud, it might become something different than curse. I remain on shore. I write the truth. And I wait to see if honesty can break what silence only strengthened.